The old bus wheezed to a stop in front of the massive iron gates. David pressed his face against the foggy window, staring at the towering stone buildings that looked more like a castle than a school. His social worker, Mrs. Chun, gathered her papers and gave him an encouraging smile. "Remember what we talked about?" she said softly. "This is your chance. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here." David nodded, clutching his worn backpack tighter. Inside were all his belongings, 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the most important thing he owned, sheet music he'd printed for free at the library. His fingers were stained with ink from where he'd traced the notes over and over again. The Riverside Academy of Music stood before him like something from a movie. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched in every direction. Students walked along, stone pathways carrying expensive instrument cases, their uniforms crisp and clean. David looked down at his own clothes, jeans with a small hole in the knee and sneakers held together with duct tape. "You sure I'm supposed to be here?" he asked Mrs. Chun as they walked through the entrance. "You earned this scholarship fair and square," she replied firmly. "Your audition video was incredible. They chose you out of thousands of applicants." David remembered that day 3 months ago. He'd borrowed a phone from his foster mom and recorded himself playing on the beat-up piano at the community center. The keys stuck, some didn't work at all, and you could hear kids playing basketball in the background. He'd been embarrassed by how rough it sounded compared to the polished videos other kids probably sent in. The main office was all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Behind the reception desk sat a woman with perfect hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked David up and down before checking her computer. "Ah, yes, the scholarship student," she said in a tone that made David's cheeks burn. "You'll be in Dormitory C, room 147. Here's your schedule and meal card." As they walked through the halls, David noticed how the other students stared. Some whispered to their friends. Others just looked right through him like he wasn't there. The walls were covered with photographs of famous graduates, concert pianists, composers, orchestra conductors. All of them looked like they came from money. "Your room is just down this hall," Mrs. Chun said, checking the room number on a brass plate. "Your roommate should be ... The door opened before they could knock. A tall boy with perfectly styled hair and a school blazer stood in the doorway. His name tag read Alexander Whitmore III. "Oh," Alexander said, his smile faltering slightly. "You must be the scholarship kid." David's stomach dropped. He'd hoped maybe, just maybe, people wouldn't know right away. But of course they did. In a place like this, everyone knew everyone's business. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand. Alexander shook it briefly, like he was afraid of catching something. "Right, well, I've taken the bed by the window." "Hope that's okay?" "My parents donated the new library wing last year, so I've been here since kindergarten." Mrs. Chen stayed for another hour, helping David unpack his few belongings. When she left, David sat on his narrow bed and looked around the room. Alexander's side was like a museum, expensive artwork, a top-of-the-line laptop, shelves full of leather-bound books. David's side had a small lamp and his stack of printed sheet music. Dinner was the worst part. The dining hall was enormous, with long wooden tables and students clustered in tight groups. David grabbed a tray and got in line, trying to ignore how the conversations quieted when he walked by. He found an empty table in the corner and ate alone, watching the other students laugh and joke with friends they'd known for years. "That's him," he heard someone whisper, "the foster kid. I heard he's never even had a real piano lesson." David's face burned, but he kept eating. He'd learned long ago not to let people see when their words hurt. After dinner, he wandered the halls until he found what he was looking for, the practice rooms. The music building was quieter at night. David pushed open the door to practice room 7, the smallest and most forgotten room in the basement. Inside was an old upright piano that had seen better days. Some of the keys were yellowed, and when he pressed middle C, it sounded slightly out of tune. But when David sat down and began to play, everything else faded away. His fingers found the familiar melody he'd been working on, a piece by Chopin that he'd learned by listening to recordings over and over. The piano might not be perfect, but it was his now. This little room, tucked away where no one bothered to look, became his sanctuary. He played until nearly midnight, losing himself in the music. When he finally stopped, he heard soft clapping from the doorway. A woman in her 50s stood there, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. "I'm Professor Martinez," she said. "I teach advanced piano here. I was walking by and heard you playing." David stood up quickly, worried he was in trouble. "I'm sorry, I didn't know if students were allowed to practice this late." "You're fine," she said, stepping into the room. "That was beautiful. You have real talent." "Thank you," David said quietly. "I know I'm not as good as the other students here. I've never had formal lessons or anything." Professor Martinez sat down on the small bench next to him. "Can I tell you something? I've been teaching here for 20 years. I've seen students who've had every advantage, private tutors, expensive instruments, parents who could buy them anything. But you know what I rarely see? Raw passion. Their kind of playing that comes from the heart." She gestured to the old piano. "This instrument has been here since the school opened. Some of our most successful graduates learned to play on this exact piano. It's not about having the fanciest equipment. It's about having something to say through your music." David felt tears prick his eyes. It was the first time since arriving that someone had spoken to him like he belonged here. "There's a competition coming up," Professor Martinez continued. "The Steinway competition. The winner gets a full scholarship to any music school in the country, plus prize money. I think you should consider entering." "Me?" David's voice cracked. "But I'm just a scholarship kid. I don't have the training the other students have." "That's exactly why you should enter," she said firmly. "You have something they don't, a story to tell. Music isn't about perfection. It's about emotion, about taking your experiences and turning them into something beautiful." That night, David lay in bed listening to Alexander's soft snoring. Through the window, he could see the practice rooms where other students were still working, their parents probably paying for private lessons even after school hours. He thought about Professor Martinez's words, about the competition, about the possibility of earning his way to a real music school, for the first time since arriving. At Riverside Academy, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe he was different from the other students. Maybe he didn't have their advantages or their connections. But he had something else, a hunger to prove himself, and music that came from a place they'd never understand. He closed his eyes and made a promise to himself. He would enter that competition. And he would show everyone that talent didn't come from money or privilege. It came from the heart. 3 weeks had passed since David's arrival at Riverside Academy. Every night he made his way down to practice room 7, and every night his playing got better. Word was starting to spread through the school, though he didn't know it yet. It started with small things. A janitor would pause outside his door, listening to the music float through the halls. A few younger students began finding excuses to walk by the practice rooms around 9 o'clock, when David usually started playing. Even some of the older students, the ones who had ignored him completely at first, started to take notice. "Did you hear the new kid playing last night?" David overheard one student whisper to another in the hallway. "He's actually pretty good." David kept his head down and pretended not to hear. He'd learned not to get too hopeful about acceptance. But deep down, the words made his heart race a little faster. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening. David was working on a particularly difficult passage when he heard footsteps in the hallway. More than usual. He kept playing, but noticed shadows gathering outside his door. When he finally looked up, at least a dozen students were standing there, listening. "Don't stop," called out a girl with short black hair. That was beautiful. For the first time since arriving, David felt like maybe he could fit in here. Maybe his music could be the bridge between his world and theirs, but not everyone was happy about David's growing reputation. In the main dormitory, where the wealthiest students lived, Isabella Ashworth sat at her expensive desk, grinding her teeth as she listened to her friends talk about the scholarship boy's talent. Isabella had been the school's star pianist for 3 years running. She'd won every competition, earned every award, and basked in the admiration of teachers and students alike. "He's just playing simple pieces," she said dismissively. "Wait until he tries something really challenging." But her friend Catherine shook her head. "I heard Professor Martinez talking to the other teachers. She thinks he might be competition material." Isabella's stomach dropped. The Steinway competition was her competition. She'd been preparing for it since freshman year. Her parents had hired the best private coaches, bought her a concert grand piano for their home, and donated thousands to the school to ensure she'd have every advantage. "That's ridiculous," Isabella said, but her voice wavered slightly. "He's been here 3 weeks. I've been training my whole life." That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She snuck out of her room and made her way to the practice building. Through the small window in practice room 7, she watched David play. His technique wasn't perfect, she could see that right away. But there was something else, something that made her chest tighten with worry. He played like the music mattered. Like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Isabella had always played to win, to impress, to maintain her status. But watching David, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that pure joy while playing. The last time music had been about more than just being better than everyone else. She hurried back to her room and called her father. "Daddy, we have a problem," she whispered into her phone. "There's a new student here. He's going to ruin everything." Jonathan Ashworth was used to his daughter's dramatics, but the panic in her voice caught his attention. "What do you mean?" "Sweetheart, he's good, Daddy, really good. And Professor Martinez is encouraging him to enter the competition. What if he wins? What if I don't get the scholarship to Juilliard?" Jonathan Ashworth was a powerful man. He owned 3 companies, sat on the boards of 5 charities, and donated more money to Riverside Academy than most families made in a year. He wasn't about to let some nobody threaten his daughter's future. "Don't worry about it, Isabella. I'll handle this." The next morning, Jonathan called the school's headmaster, Dr. William Hayes. They'd known each other for years, ever since Jonathan had started making his generous donations to the school. "William, I need to discuss something with you," Jonathan said over the phone. "It's about the upcoming competition." Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He could hear the tension in his biggest donor's voice. "Of course, Jonathan. What's on your mind?" "I understand you have a new scholarship student who's attracting attention. David something?" "David Chun, yes, he's quite talented actually. Professor Martinez thinks he has real potential." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Jonathan said smoothly. "Don't get me wrong, I support the scholarship program. It's wonderful that we're giving opportunities to less fortunate students, but we need to be realistic about expectations." Dr. Hayes frowned. "I'm not sure I follow." "Think about it, William. This boy comes from nothing. Foster care, I believe? No formal training, no musical background. If he were to win the competition, what message would that send to our regular students and their families? The families who pay full tuition and support this school?" The headmaster felt his stomach twist. He knew exactly what Jonathan was getting at. "I see your point, but surely we can't just ... "I'm not asking you to do anything improper," Jonathan interrupted. "I'm simply suggesting that we make sure the competition is fair, that every student has the same equipment, the same opportunities. Nothing more." But Dr. Hayes had worked with wealthy donors long enough to understand the subtext. Jonathan Ashworth wasn't making a suggestion, he was making a threat. And with the school's budget depending heavily on donations like his, Dr. Hayes couldn't afford to ignore it. "I'll look into it," he said quietly. "I knew I could count on you," Jonathan replied. "Oh, and William, let's keep this conversation between us. No need to involve the faculty in administrative decisions." After hanging up, Dr. Hayes sat in his office for a long time, staring out the window at the students walking across the campus. He'd gotten into education to help young people reach their potential. But somewhere along the way, he'd become more concerned with balancing budgets and keeping donors happy. He thought about David, the quiet boy who'd impressed everyone with his audition video, The boy who practiced every night in the basement, working twice as hard as students who'd had every advantage. The boy who deserved a fair chance, but he also thought about the school's finances, about Jonathan Ashworth's donation checks, about what would happen if the Academy's biggest supporter decided to take his money elsewhere. By the end of the day, Dr. Hayes had made his decision. He called the head of maintenance, Mr. Rodriguez, into his office. "I need you to do something for me," he said quietly. "It's about the pianos for the competition." Mr. Rodriguez had been working at the school for 15 years. He'd seen plenty of behind-the-scenes politics, but this request made him uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm not sure that's right." "It's not about right or wrong," Dr. Hayes said, avoiding eye contact. "It's about maintaining the balance of our school community. The boy will still have a chance to perform. We're just leveling the playing field." Mr. Rodriguez wanted to argue, but he had a family to feed and couldn't afford to lose his job. "Which piano did you have in mind?" "Piano number 3. Make sure it looks perfect on the outside, but adjust the action just enough to make it challenging. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would be detected in a casual inspection. Just enough to make precise playing difficult." That night, while David practiced in his little room, completely unaware of the forces working against him, Mr. Rodriguez worked alone in the main auditorium. With a heavy heart, he made the subtle adjustments that would sabotage the young man's chances. Meanwhile, Isabella lay in her expensive bed, finally able to sleep peacefully. Her father had assured her that everything would be fine, that the competition would go exactly as planned. She never asked exactly what that meant, and her father never offered to explain. The trap was set. David continued to practice, his passion for music growing stronger each day, completely unaware that his biggest challenge wouldn't be the competition itself, but the people who had decided he didn't deserve to win it. The competition was only 2 days away, and David could barely sleep. He'd been practicing for weeks, perfecting every note, every pause, every emotion in his chosen piece. His fingers had memorized every key on the old piano in practice room. 7, and he felt ready, but today was different. Today he would finally get to practice on his assigned piano in the main auditorium. David walked through the grand hall, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The auditorium was massive, with red velvet seats arranged in perfect rows and a stage that seemed to stretch forever. In the center sat 6 beautiful grand pianos, each one gleaming under the stage lights. "You're assigned to piano number 3, said Mrs. Patterson, the competition coordinator, checking her clipboard. "You have 2 hours to get familiar with it." David's heart raced as he approached the instrument. It was the most beautiful piano he'd ever seen up close. The black surface was so polished he could see his reflection, and the keys looked like perfect ivory teeth in a welcoming smile. He sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. This was it. This was what he'd been working toward. The first chord sounded ... wrong. David frowned and tried again. The E-flat key felt sluggish, like it was fighting against his finger. He pressed it several times, and each time it responded just a fraction too late. Maybe he was just nervous. Maybe he was overthinking it. He began to play his piece from the beginning, but within the first few measures he knew something was seriously wrong. The sustain pedal caught slightly each time he pressed it, creating an inconsistent sound that threw off his timing. Several keys felt heavy and unresponsive, forcing him to press harder than usual. David stopped playing and looked around the auditorium. The other pianos sat silent, waiting for their assigned students. He wondered if they had the same problems. "Excuse me," he called to Mrs. Patterson, who was organizing papers at a nearby table. "I think there might be something wrong with this piano." She looked up with mild annoyance. "What kind of problem?" "Some of the keys are sticking and the pedal doesn't respond smoothly. It feels like the action is off." Mrs. Patterson sighed and walked over to the piano. She pressed a few keys quickly, playing a simple scale. To someone who didn't know the instrument well, it probably sounded fine. "It sounds perfectly normal to me," she said. "These pianos were all tuned yesterday by our head technician. Perhaps you're just not used to playing on such a high-quality instrument." David's cheeks burned. He knew what she was implying, that he was just a scholarship kid who didn't know the difference between a good piano and a bad one. But he'd been playing piano for years, even if it was on beat-up instruments. He knew when something felt wrong. Could I maybe try one of the other pianos? He asked quietly. Just to compare? Absolutely not, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. The piano assignments are final. Each student gets the instrument they're assigned, and that's piano number 3 for you. David spent the next hour and a half trying to adapt to the instruments. Quirks. The sticky E-flat key was in a crucial part of his piece, and every time he hit it, the note came out weak and delayed. The pedal problems made it impossible to create the smooth, flowing sound he'd practiced for weeks by the time his practice session ended. David's hands were shaking with frustration. He'd never felt so helpless at a piano before. It was like trying to run a race with a stone in his shoe. That evening, David found Professor Martinez in her office. She looked up from her papers and smiled when she saw him, but her expression quickly changed when she noticed his worried face. David, what's wrong? You look upset. It's the piano, he said, slumping into the chair across from her desk. The one I'm assigned for the competition. Something's wrong with it, Professor Martinez frowned. What kind of problem? David explained about the sticky keys, the unresponsive pedal, and how different it felt from every other piano he'd played. As he talked, he watched her expression grow more serious. That's strange, she said when he finished. Those pianos are maintained by the best technicians in the city. They're checked before every major event. Mrs. Patterson said it was tuned yesterday and that it sounded fine to her. She wouldn't let me try any of the other pianos. Professor Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. She'd been teaching at Riverside Academy for 20 years, and she'd seen plenty of politics and favoritism. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you had any problems with other students? Any conflicts or disagreements? David shook his head. Not really. I mean, some people aren't very friendly, but nobody's been mean to me or anything. Professor Martinez knew about Isabella Ashworth's reputation, about her family's influence at the school. She also knew that David's growing talent had been the talk of the faculty lounge for weeks. It wouldn't be the first time a wealthy family had tried to influence a competition, but she'd never seen it done so obviously. David, I have to be careful about what I say. If I'm wrong, it could cost me my job, but I think someone might be trying to sabotage your chances. David's eyes widened. You really think so? I can't prove it, but yes. The question is, what are we going to do about it? They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking. Professor Martinez knew she could try to talk to Dr. Hayes, but if the headmaster was involved, that could make things worse. She could demand that David be given a different piano, but without proof of sabotage, it would just look like favoritism. What if I just practiced more on that piano? David asked. If I can figure out how to work with its problems, maybe I can still play well. Professor. Martinez looked at him with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Here was a 17-year-old boy who'd already faced more challenges than most adults, and his first instinct was to work harder rather than give up. You could try, she said carefully. But David, you need to understand what you're up against. If someone is deliberately trying to stop you from winning, they have resources and connections that we don't. But they can't actually stop me from playing, right? I mean, I still get to compete? Yes, you still get to compete, but then that's all I need, David interrupted. I've been playing on broken pianos my whole life. The one at the community center had 3 keys that didn't work at all. The one in my old foster home was so out of tune it hurt to listen to. Maybe this is actually perfect practice for me. Professor Martinez felt tears prick her eyes. She'd seen so many talented students over the years, but David's determination was something special. Most of her students had never faced real adversity. When things got difficult, they had parents who could solve their problems with money or connections. David didn't have those advantages. But he had something else, a resilience that came from years of making the best of bad situations. Okay. she said finally. If you're determined to do this, I'll help you. We'll go to the auditorium tonight after everyone else has gone home. You can practice on that piano for as long as you need to. They met at the auditorium at 10 o'clock that night. The building was dark except for the stage lights, and their footsteps echoed in the empty space. David sat down at piano number 3 and began to play for the next 4 hours. Professor Martinez watched as David slowly transformed the piano's flaws into part of his interpretation. Where the E-flat key stuck, he learned to press it with extra force and turn the slight delay into a dramatic pause. Where the pedal caught, he adjusted his technique to create a different kind of musical phrasing. It was like watching someone learn to paint with broken brushes or dance with a sprained ankle. By the time they finished, David had turned the sabotaged piano into an instrument that served his unique style. You know, Professor Martinez said as they packed up to leave, I think whoever did this to you might have made a mistake. They tried to give you a piano that would make you sound bad, but instead they gave you one that no one else could play as well as you. David smiled for the first time in days. You think so? I know so. Tomorrow you're going to walk onto that stage and play like no one has ever played before. Because you're not just playing music, David, you're playing your story. As they walked out of the auditorium, David felt a strange sense of calm. He'd spent his whole life adapting to difficult circumstances, and this was just one more challenge to overcome. Tomorrow he would show everyone what he could do, broken piano and all. The morning of the competition arrived with gray clouds and a light drizzle that matched David's nervous energy. He'd barely slept, his mind running through every note, every finger position, every moment where the piano might fight against him. He stood at his dormitory window, watching expensive cars pull up to the academy entrance, dropping off families dressed in their finest clothes. Alexander was already gone, probably having breakfast with his parents at some fancy restaurant before the competition. David grabbed a granola bar from his desk drawer and headed to the dining hall alone. His stomach was too twisted with nerves to eat much anyway. The dining hall buzzed with excitement. Students who weren't competing clustered around tables, talking about who they thought would win. David caught fragments of conversations as he walked by with his tray. Isabella's been preparing for this since she was 12, one student whispered. Her private coach is from Vienna. Yeah, but did you hear that foster kid play last week? He's actually pretty good. Good isn't enough at this level. You need years of proper training. David found an empty table near the back and ate his breakfast slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. Through the tall windows he could see more. Cars arriving, parents in expensive suits, younger siblings in designer clothes, grandparents with proud smiles. Everyone seemed to belong to a family, to a community, to a world that David had never been part of. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chun, his social worker. Good luck today. I know you'll do great. Remember, you've already won just by getting this far. David smiled despite his nerves. She was right. 6 months ago, he'd been living in a group home, practicing on a keyboard with half the keys broken. Now he was about to compete in one of the most prestigious music competitions in the state. By 11 o'clock, the auditorium was nearly full. David peeked through the curtains at the audience and felt his knees go weak. There had to be 400 people out there. He spotted Professor Martinez in the third row, giving him a small nod of encouragement when their eyes met. The other 5 competitors were warming up on practice. Pianos backstage. David listened to each of them, his heart sinking with every perfectly executed scale and flawless arpeggio. Isabella was particularly impressive, her fingers flying across the keys with mechanical precision. Her parents sat in the front row, her father checking his expensive watch and her mother adjusting her pearl necklace. Contestants, please gather for the final briefing, called Mrs. Patterson. David joined the small group of competitors. They all looked calm and confident, like they'd done this 100 times before. Isabella wore an elegant black dress that probably cost more than David's entire wardrobe. Her smile was perfectly practiced, but David noticed she wouldn't meet his eyes. Remember, you'll perform in the order we discussed, Mrs. Patterson explained. Each of you will have exactly 12 minutes on stage. The judges will announce the winner immediately after all performances are complete. David was scheduled to perform fifth right after Isabella. As they walked toward the stage entrance, he felt his hands starting to shake. This was it. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed about, came down to the next few hours. The first contestant, a boy named Christopher, played a beautiful piece by Bach. His technique was flawless, his timing perfect. The audience applauded politely when he finished. David knew it was a solid performance, but it felt safe, predictable. The second and third performers were similarly skilled. David found himself analyzing their playing, noticing how they favored technical precision over emotional expression. They played like they were afraid to make mistakes, like they were more concerned with impressing the judges than with touching the audience. Then it was Isabella's turn. She walked onto the stage with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted. She belonged there. Her dress flowed behind her as she took her place at the beautiful grand piano assigned to her. She adjusted the bench height slightly, flexed her fingers, and began to play. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging works in the classical repertoire. Isabella's fingers moved like liquid across the keys, hitting every note with surgical precision. Her timing was perfect, her dynamics exactly what the score demanded. David watched from the wings, his heart pounding. She was incredible. Years of expensive lessons, private coaches, and performance experience showed in every measure. The audience was mesmerized, leaning forward in their seats as she navigated the most difficult passages without a single mistake. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Isabella stood and curtsied gracefully, her smile radiant. As she walked off stage, David caught a glimpse of her father in the audience, nodding with satisfaction. Her mother was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "That was amazing," whispered Thomas, the contestant scheduled after David. "How are any of us supposed to follow that?" David felt his confidence crumbling. Isabella hadn't just played well, she'd played perfectly. Every note had been exactly where it was supposed to be, every phrase shaped with mathematical precision. How could he compete with that kind of technical mastery? "David Chun, you're up next," Mrs. Patterson said, checking her clipboard. David's legs felt like jelly as he walked toward the stage. Through the curtains, he could see piano number 3 waiting for him under the bright lights. The sabotage piano, the instrument that had been deliberately rigged to work against him. He paused at the edge of the stage, his heart hammering so hard he was sure the audience could hear it. This was his moment. Everything he'd been through, the foster homes, the rejection, the nights practicing on broken instruments, had led to this. Professor Martinez caught his eye from the audience and mouthed the words, "Tell your story." David took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The applause was polite but noticeably quieter than it had been for Isabella. David could feel the audience's skepticism, their doubt about whether the scholarship kid belonged on the same stage as their privileged children. He sat down at piano number 3 and adjusted the bench to his height. The keys felt exactly as he remembered, some responsive, others sluggish. The pedal had that slight catch that would throw off anyone who wasn't prepared for it. But David was prepared. He'd spent hours learning to work with these flaws, turning them into part of his musical voice. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The piece was Chopin's Ballade No., a work that required both technical skill and deep emotional understanding. From the very first notes, David made a choice. Instead of trying to play perfectly like Isabella had, he played honestly. He poured his story into the music, the loneliness, the hope, the struggle, the determination. Where the E-flat key stuck, he turned the delay into a moment of reflection. Where the pedal caught, he used the break in sound to create dramatic tension. What should have been technical problems became expressions of his journey. The audience began to shift in their seats. This wasn't the polished, predictable performance they'd expected. This was raw, emotional, real. David wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was sharing his heart. As he moved through the piece, David forgot about the competition, forgot about the judges, forgot about everything except the music. This was why he played. Not to win awards or impress people, but to transform his experiences into something beautiful when he reached the final section. The most challenging part of the piece, David felt completely connected to the music. His fingers found every note, even on the problematic keys. The faulty pedal became part of his interpretation, creating a unique sound that no perfect piano could have produced. The last note rang out in the silent auditorium. David sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the keys, feeling the vibration fade away. Then he looked up at the audience. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then slowly one person began to clap, then another. Then the entire auditorium erupted in the loudest applause David had ever heard. As he stood and bowed, David saw faces in the audience he'd never seen before. People were crying, smiling, rising to their feet. Professor Martinez was beaming with pride. Even some of the other students looked moved by what they'd just heard, but it was the expression on Isabella's face that surprised him most. Standing in the wings, she was clapping too, and for the first time since he'd met her, her smile looked genuine. David walked off stage knowing that whatever happened next, he'd given everything he had. He'd taken a broken piano and turned it into something beautiful, just like he'd done with his life. The final contestant, Thomas, walked onto the stage with shaking hands. Following David's performance was like trying to speak after hearing poetry. The audience was still buzzing with energy, people whispering to each other about what they'd just witnessed. Thomas played well, but everyone could tell his heart wasn't really in it. He kept glancing at the judges, trying to read their expressions. When he finished, the applause was respectful but brief. The magic that David had created still hung in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Dr. Hayes from the podium, "the judges will now deliberate. We'll have the results in approximately 20 minutes. The contestants were led to a small waiting room behind the stage. David sat in the corner, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He'd given everything he had out there, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. Isabella sat across from him, unusually quiet. She kept looking at him like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she moved to the chair next to his. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I've never heard anyone play like that." David looked at her in surprise. "Thank you. You were amazing too. I don't think I've ever heard Rachmaninoff played so perfectly." Isabella's smile was sad. "Perfect, that's all I've ever been taught to be. Perfect technique, perfect timing, perfect everything. But watching you up there, you made me realize I've forgotten why I started playing in the first place." Before David could respond, the door opened and Mrs. Patterson appeared. "It's time. The judges have reached their decision." They filed back onto the stage where 6 chairs had been arranged in a line. The auditorium had filled even more during the deliberation, with people standing in the back because all the seats were taken. David spotted Mrs. Chun in the crowd. Somehow she'd made it to the competition. She gave him a thumbs up and mouthed, "I'm proud of you." The head judge, a distinguished woman named Dr. Rebecca Williams, stepped forward with an envelope. "This year's competition has been exceptional. Each contestant demonstrated remarkable skill and dedication. However, one performance stood out, not just for its technical ability, but for its emotional depth and unique interpretation." David's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This was it. In a few seconds he'd know if all his hard work had paid off. "The winner of this year's Steinway competition is ... quotes Dr. Williams paused, looking out at the audience. "David Chun," the auditorium exploded. People jumped to their feet, cheering and applauding. David sat frozen in his chair, unable to believe what he'd just heard. He'd won. He'd actually won. Professor Martinez was crying openly in the 3rd row. Mrs. Chun was hugging the stranger next to her. Even some of the other contestants were clapping enthusiastically, but not everyone was celebrating. In the front row, Jonathan Ashworth's face had turned red with anger. He stood up abruptly, his wife grabbing his arm to try to stop him. But he shook her off and began pushing through the crowd toward the stage. This is ridiculous, he shouted, his voice carrying over the applause. How can you give the prize to that boy? He's been here 3 months. My daughter has been training her entire life. The applause died down as people turned to stare at him. Dr. Hayes rushed toward the stage, clearly panicking. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. Mr. Ashworth, please, Dr. Hayes said, trying to keep his voice calm. The judge's decision is final? Perhaps we could discuss this privately. No. Jonathan's voice echoed through the auditorium. I want everyone to hear this. Do you people have any idea how much money my family has donated to this school? How much we've sacrificed to give Isabella every advantage? Isabella stood up from her chair, her face pale with embarrassment. Dad, please stop. I will not stop, he continued, now standing at the edge of the stage. This competition was supposed to be fair, but instead you give the prize to some foster kid who doesn't even belong here. The crowd began to murmur uncomfortably. David felt his cheeks burning with shame. Even in his moment of triumph, he was being reminded that he was different, that he didn't belong. But then Jonathan made a crucial mistake. We made sure that boy got exactly what he deserved, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Piano number 3 was adjusted specifically for him. A few sticky keys, a temperamental pedal, nothing obvious, just enough to level the playing field. A collective gasp went through the audience. Professor Martinez stood up in the 3rd row, her face filled with understanding and anger. You sabotaged his piano? She called out, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. Jonathan realized immediately that he'd said too much. That's not what I meant. But Dr. Hayes's expression had changed completely. The headmaster's face was white with shock and horror. Mr. Ashworth, are you saying you deliberately interfered with the competition? Now, wait just a minute, Jonathan started, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Dr. Williams, the head judge, stepped forward. If what you're saying is true, then this young man won the competition despite being given a defective instrument. The pieces fell into place for everyone at once. David hadn't just won, he'd won while playing on a piano. That had been rigged against him. What they'd thought was an impressive performance was actually extraordinary, David, Dr. Williams said, turning to him. Did you know your piano had been tampered with? David stood up slowly, his legs still shaky. I knew something was wrong. With it, the keys felt different and the pedal kept sticking. But I thought maybe I was just nervous, or maybe I wasn't used to such an expensive piano. And you didn't ask for a different instrument? I tried, David said quietly. But Mrs. Patterson said the assignments were final. So I just practiced extra hard to work with the problems. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The story was becoming clear. A wealthy donor had tried to rig the competition against a talented scholarship student, but the student had won anyway. Mr. Ashworth, Dr. Hayes said, his voice shaking with controlled anger, I think you need to leave, immediately. You can't speak to me that way, Jonathan protested. Without your donations, this school would have its integrity, Dr. Hayes interrupted. Security, please escort Mr. Ashworth from the building. As Jonathan was led away, still shouting about lawyers and consequences, Isabella walked over to David. Her eyes were filled with tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know he would do something like this. I just told him I was worried about the competition, and he said he'd handle it. David looked at her for a long moment. She was crying now, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks. Despite everything, he felt sorry for her. It's okay, he said finally. You didn't know. No, it's not okay, Isabella said firmly. You won this competition fair and square. Actually, you won it the hard way, and I need to learn how to play like you do, with heart, not just technique. Dr. Williams called for attention again. In light of these revelations, I want to make something clear. David Chin's victory today is even more remarkable than we initially realized. He didn't just play beautifully, he overcame deliberate sabotage to do so. This is the kind of determination and artistry that true musicians are made of. The applause started again, even louder than before. David felt overwhelmed by the support, the validation. The proof that he really did belong here. As he accepted his trophy and scholarship certificate, David thought about all the people who had helped him along the way. Professor Martinez, who had believed in him from the beginning, Mrs. Chun, who had fought to get him this opportunity, even the janitor who had stopped to listen to him practice. I want to thank everyone who supported me, David said into the microphone. But most of all, I want to thank the people who tried to stop me. You taught me that talent isn't about having the best equipment or the most advantages. It's about taking whatever you're given and finding a way to make it beautiful. He looked out at the audience, at all the faces looking back at him with respect and admiration. I'm going to use this scholarship to study music, but I'm also going to start a program to help other kids like me. Kids who love music but don't have the resources to pursue it. Because everyone deserves a chance to find their voice. As David walked off the stage, trophy in hand, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Not just pride in his achievement, but a sense of belonging. He'd proven that he didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. He just needed to be himself. The broken piano had been meant to break him. Instead, it had helped him discover that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from overcoming the things that try to silence you.